So just to summarize for folks watching the recording, so we just finished the background. I'll just jump to the beginning. Here's the title slide. Background, online exams are here probably to stay. They're at least becoming more prevalent. We want to look at exam responses to look for exam similarity. Uniqueness of shared incorrect responses is going to be the signal that I'm going to be focusing on. So hopefully now people in the recording are also up to speed.
Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, let's jump into this exam similarity score. So let's denote, and this is now going to get a little bit mathy, but I'm going to like pause between each of the mathy steps to kind of verbally explain it in just colloquial English. So let Q denote, or capital Q denote the set of all questions on the exam. So the magnitude of Q is the total number of questions on the exam. And in this example, for the purposes of this talk, I'm assuming that there's no randomization in the exam. I'm assuming every student gets the exact same exam with the exact same questions. So denote W of Q, W for wrong, let that denote the number of students who put a wrong answer for question lowercase q, where lowercase q is one question in capital Q in the set of all questions. So let's think about the scenario where students X and Y put the same exact wrong answer for lowercase q, for question Q. Let D, Q, X, Y, so D for different, let D, Q, X, Y denote the number of students who submitted a different incorrect response for Q. So in other words, the number of students who also got question Q wrong, but put a different wrong answer than the one that X and Y put. And let this value be 0 otherwise. So let this value be 0 if either X or Y got the question right. Let this value be 0 if X and Y both got it wrong, but put a different wrong answer. So it's only non-zero if X and Y put the exact same wrong answer, in which case it's the number of students who put a different wrong answer. So I'm going to then define P of QXY, so P for proportion, as just being D of QXY divided by W of Q. Or in other words, it's the proportion of students, so denominator being number of students who got the question wrong. It's the proportion of those students who put a different wrong answer. So just thinking about this number is going to be 0 if every single student who got this question wrong put the exact same wrong answer. So for example, a true or false question. And this number is going to approach 1 as this response is more and more unique. So if these two students are the only ones who put this wrong answer, P of QXY is going to approach 1. It's going to be just under 1. Okay, any questions so far? I know mathy stuff gets messy quickly. Okay, so the similarity score that I define is just summing up this value for every single question in the exam. So this P of QXY, I just sum it up for every single question on the exam. And then to have it be comparable across exams, I just normalize by the number of questions. So in other words, I'm taking the average. But yeah, just sum it up and then divide by the number of questions on the exam. Okay. And if you want, I have an open source implementation of this. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you don't have to do this yourself. It's already implemented in Python. So what can we do with this? Well, here I'm plotting, this is from an actual exam from one of my classes, and I'm plotting the distribution of exam similarity scores across all pairwise students, like all pairs of students in the class. So for every single n choose 2 possible students, calculate the similarity score, plot the distribution, and note that I'm plotting this in log scale on the vertical axis. So on the horizontal axis here is that similarity score. I call it MESS for Moshiri exam similarity score, also as kind of a pun on MOS. I'm sure people here have used MOS. So horizontal axis is the score, and then vertical axis is the frequency. So the number of students that put this exact same, I forgot if this plot is showing number or proportion, but it doesn't matter. Like the number of students that put that have that specific similarity score. So it's just a histogram. And here is the actual distribution. So how can I detect, suspicious exam collaboration from this distribution? Well, oh, and by the way, so these are discrete because we're counting, right? The smallest count that you can have is 1 pair of students. So there is a minimum value that this distribution can have. It's not completely continuous. So the smallest count is one pair of students. Or if it's a proportion, it's 1 out of n choose 2 for a class with n students. So how do I detect exam collaboration here? Well, I could take this rightmost outlier and be like, huh, that sticks out quite a bit. That's probably suspicious. Okay, let me move to the next one. Okay, that's also, that's kind of an outlier, it looks like. So maybe that one's also suspicious. Then I can kind of go one by one by one by one. But it would be nicer if I had a more theoretical framework for how to detect significance from like a statistical perspective. So rather than just kind of eyeballing one by one until I get to like this messier clump over here, can we come up with some more rigorous statistical significance definition? Which will be the focus of the next part. So I'll pause again briefly. Any questions so far? Feel free to just, I guess, answer out or call out. All good?
Good.
Perfect. Okay. So how do I detect statistical significance of similarity from this distribution? Well, clearly these ones look like they're significant, but how can I actually tell a reasonable cutoff? So if you'll notice, this portion of the plot looks fairly similar. And again, I want to remind you, we're looking at a histogram in log scale. And the kind of squiggly dashed line, this is the kernel density estimate. So for folks that are not familiar, that's basically an estimation of the probability density function. So it's estimating the smooth probability distribution from this histogram. And you'll notice that we have a little bit of like funkiness at the beginning. We have these kind of outlier funkiness at the end, but there's this segment of this plot that looks very nicely, almost linear. So in log scale of a probability distribution, one probability distribution that has a linear probability density function in log scale is the exponential distribution. So what I could do is I could fit a best fit line according to that somewhat linear segment, which hopefully should be a good estimate of the null distribution, because my assumption is most pairs of students, if I just do all n choose 2 pairs of students, most pairs of students did not collaborate because most students don't know every other student in the class. So this is hopefully a good estimate of the null distribution. I can fit a best fit line in log scale, and then I can fit an exponential distribution onto that to see what exponential distribution has this probability density function of this best fit line. So then by doing that, I can now, calculate theoretical p-values. So this empirical kind of learned exponential distribution has its own continuous probability density function. And a p-value, recall, is just the probability of observing this significant of results or more significant purely by random chance. So on this distribution, it's a right-tailed distribution where the right side is like more significant. It's not like a two-sided significance test. So I can calculate theoretical p-values by just seeing what is the integral of that PDF, or in other words, what is the CDF value at any given score to infinity. So basically take the area under the PDF that I've theoretically calculated now from that best fit line from any given point to infinity, and that gives me a p-value for this pair of students, or for that significance score, I should say. And then I could do the same thing, for each of these, I could then calculate the area under this curve for like this whole area, et cetera. And each of those will give me a p-value. So now I could do this, and then the moment I hit whatever significance threshold I think is reasonable, that is one way of calculating statistical significance. So questions so far before the next section? And this is also implemented for you. Oh yeah, go for it.
You mentioned this was a one-sided test, and I'm looking at the weirdness at the top of the curve. I know this is measuring similarity within the classroom. Is that top weirdness indicative of so strange that something was copied? Is that a highly specific individual response, or is it just noise?
Good. Are you asking about this section specifically?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So I've been wondering what this little dip at the beginning is every quarter. So I haven't honed in on like a specific rationale for what it is, but one of the thoughts that I have is I think because exams are like you're going to have some harder questions and some easier questions just purely either by chance or by design. Um, some of the questions are going to have common misconceptions that are going to lead to common identical incorrect answers. So my kind of personal interpretation that you should take with a grain of salt because I haven't thoroughly explored it is I think this dip is probably because we don't have truly completely uniformly random responses. So these are probably you don't have zero similarity purely by chance because we actually will have some skew towards certain shared incorrect responses for some of the questions on the exam. So I think this is kind of capturing that it's not completely random responses in the null distribution.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, great question. But yeah, definitely something that I'd be curious to explore more in the future. Good question.
Oh, I see another question.
Oh, perfect.
Curious, does that dip occur in exactly the same place every semester, or is it slightly different? And follow-up question, do you think analyzing the position of that dip could be a significant metric? Do you think that could be used as a metric to evaluate an exam?
Ooh, great question. Great question. So the first question of do I always see this dip in the same location every quarter? So every quarter I get this exact same general shape where I have a dip at the beginning, then a linear thing that's kind of like wobbly, and then it gets more wobbly, and then it gets like super wobbly across quarters, across topics. So I've done this in an advanced data structure course, and I've also done it in an intro non-majors programming course, a Python programming course. So like very different subject matter. And I see the exact same trend every time. Exact same place changes because even after normalization, um, the width of this kind of changes between exams. So sometimes it's always the same shape, and I can find a point where I can squeeze them or stretch them to make them look similar. But even after normalization, sometimes they're like squished or lengthened. I think just as a property of what questions happen to be on the exam. So what level of similarity happens just kind of by random chance. So short answer is yes, generally always in the same place, but it moves a little bit. Like it might be slightly wider or slightly thinner depending on the exam. And then your second question of could that also be used as signal? That's a great question. So I think it could be, and it could be an additional kind of, so right now, the only signal that I'm using for coming up with this best fit curve that is then only used to do statistical significance from a theoretical exponential distribution. I'm only using like kind of this little slice over here, the decently straight portion of this distribution. But I can imagine instead of using an exponential distribution, which is like a very simple distribution, I could come up with something a little bit more complicated that then also maybe, you can maybe use like a mixture model where like maybe I fit some distribution to this piece and then a separate distribution to this piece and come up with like a mixture model for the two, or maybe come up with like multiple splits and fit different models onto each of them. So I think definitely there's some interesting signal there that could be taken advantage of, but I just haven't done it myself. That's a great question.
Throwing an idea out there, I think I could be wrong about this, but I think if there's greater variation in incorrect answers in an exam, that might be a sign of, that may be a sign of how effective the exam is, because if there's more variation in incorrect answers, there are more ways in which people can go wrong. So just throwing that idea out there, that might be, I just think that might be something interesting to analyze. And thank you for entertaining my questions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And actually, so kind of to piggyback off your point about like especially high variation in the response can be useful signal in terms of like the exam fairness or how effective of an exam it was. So I've actually in the past had questions that like by doing this type of analysis, not only is it that the correct answer is not the most frequent, like not only is it that the correct answer is not abundantly most frequent, but actually I've had cases where like an incorrect answer is actually the most frequent response, which has been surprising. So it's been helpful for me to like dig into very common misconceptions that I then like do more practice problems on that very specific thing in the future. Because they are usually, in my experience, they were questions that I did want to test. But it is surprising that a bunch of students made the exact same mistake as the majority. So it has come up as like very useful, like help me figure out what things I want to focus on more in depth next quarter type of signal. So yeah, absolutely. Great question. Awesome. Okay, so now we've kind of highlighted an approach. We've highlighted, okay, I can calculate the similarity score from all pairs of students in the class. I can plot the distribution. I can fit an exponential distribution to that. And then I can use that theoretical exponential distribution to calculate p-values by just taking area under the probability density function of that exponential distribution from each score to infinity. And that gets me a p-value on each of these individual scores. However, and I don't know if anyone here is in bioinformatics, but in bioinformatics, we have a common problem when we do gene expression analysis studies, which is multiple hypothesis test correction. So basically, when I'm doing this p-value calculation and then see, is it statistically significant according to whatever arbitrary threshold I want, maybe 0.01, maybe 0.001, who knows? Okay, if I do it on this one, I'm now doing a second hypothesis test using the exact same data set. And if I do it again, I'm now doing a third hypothesis test on the exact same data set. So remember that the p-value definition of a given X score, it's the probability of observing a score greater than or equal to X purely by random chance. So every single one of those p-value calculations that I'm then trying to see, is it statistically significant or not, is a hypothesis test. So if I use a significant threshold of, for example, 5%, I would expect 5% of these to be significant purely by random chance. So we can account for this by performing multiple hypothesis test correction, which is a way of kind of controlling for the false discovery rate, or like somehow controlling for these spurious significant results that we would expect just because we're doing a bunch of hypothesis tests on the same exact data set. This is a very well-studied field. There's a type of correction called Bonferroni correction, a type of correction called Benjamini-Hochberg correction, et cetera, that can transform your raw p-values into corrected q-values, we typically call them. And these are all implemented in MES in the Python score as well, the Python code as well. So nothing too fancy here, but basically, yeah, you would run one of these hypothesis test correction techniques that you think is appropriate, and then use those q values instead of p values to determine significance. Cool. Any questions? That was a fairly short section. Okay, so implementation. Oh yeah, go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
To the hand up.
Can you explain what you mean by a corrected Q value?
Yeah, great question. So for example, so Bonferroni correction is the simplest of the multiple hypothesis test correction. So imagine I have, like, let's say that I have like P, oh wait, am I typing on the screen? Nope. Let's say I have like P equals 0.001 and P equals 0.02 and P equals 0.003. And like, let's say these are from the 3 highest similarity scores. These are the theoretical p-values that I get. And let's imagine that the number of students is like 400 in my class, because we have insanely large classes. So the number of pairs of students would be n choose 2, which would be, I didn't do this in my head. I like busted out a calculator real quick. I'm not that good at math. Would be that many students. So whoops, let me get rid of my, shoot, how do I get rid of my calculator? There we go. Okay. So Bonferroni correction is one of the simplest, but one of the most strict versions of multiple hypothesis test correction, which basically you can either take your p-values as is and adjust your similarity threshold, not similarity threshold, sorry, your significance threshold, or you could keep your significance threshold as is and increase your p-values to kind of compensate. So Bonferroni correction, I could either say, instead of having like, let's say 0.05 as my significance cutoff, I could, so Bonferroni correction would say, let me take my previous significance cutoff and just multiply it by how many hypothesis tests that I did. So either 79, 800 if I did every single possible p-value calculation, or if I only did like the top 50 or something like that, multiplied by 50. But however many hypothesis tests that I do, I could increase my, sorry, not increase, whoops. That would make it easier. I could divide my previous statistical significance threshold by how many hypothesis tests that I did, whether it's every single n choose 2 possible test, or I chose some subset of them to do, and make my significance threshold more strict, but keep the p-values the same. Or alternatively, I could keep the threshold the same and just multiply each of the p-values by how many hypothesis tests that I did. And I would say that that's my corrected Q value. And you have to like then cap it at 1 because you can't have a probability greater than 1. So yeah, so basically the Q values are basically taking whatever one of these multiple hypothesis test correction techniques that you're doing, but keeping the significance threshold the same. How do I transform these raw p-values into a corrected, we call it Q value, such that the comparison with my significance threshold is statistically equivalent to if I had done just a single statistical test on my p-value space, if that kind of makes sense. So basically, let me blow up my p-values, which makes them less significant, quote unquote, to compensate for the fact that I'm doing so many statistical tests in a kind of rigorous way that has nice mathematical definitions that kind of control for the false discovery rate or other corrections that you do. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or just go in. Awesome. Yeah, great question so far. Thanks, folks. Okay, so that kind of describes the theory behind it. There's actually one additional type of signal that I've, since my original study, and this is kind of new that I don't think Dan has seen yet either, because I presented this roughly 2 years ago, but not with some of the new stuff. So some of the new stuff that I've done tries to capture a different dimension of this problem. So everything that I've been talking about over here is trying to look at a lot of like shared unique responses. So there's kind of 2 dimensions that make the exam similarity score that I've described big. Either you can have more questions that you have the same wrong answer for, but those questions don't necessarily need to have very unique shared wrong answers, right? So basically add up a relatively small similarity score for each question, but do it for a bunch of different questions would get you a big overall similarity score. Or on the other side, you could have one really, really, really unique shared wrong answer, but not a lot of different questions. So there's kind of those 2 separate dimensions at play with the similarity score. The number of shared wrong answers and how unique those shared wrong answers were. So since then, I've now also decoupled it and I have an analysis for just looking at the shared wrong answers. So before I jump into this, I want to kind of pose a question to the audience just to brainstorm. So imagine I told you student X and student Y had 5 identical incorrect responses on an exam that had 40 questions total. Is that suspicious or is it not suspicious? And why? So I tell you that they had 5 identical wrong answers on an exam with 40 questions. Or is there not information? Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I would probably first ask if they're true or false questions, because then you just have like a 50% probability of getting it right or wrong, right? That's a good point.
That's a good point. Let's say not true or false, but the argument could still hold for true or false. But just to like hit it home, let's say not true or false. Let's say like probability questions. Let's say like they're math questions.
I would say there is a higher probability.
So you think it's suspicious? So they put the same wrong answer for 5 out of 20 questions. Or 5 out of 40 questions. There's 40 questions on the exam. They have 5 shared wrong answers.
I would say that it's very important to see like kind of like have a weight for every single question because you can't like discriminate against the fact that like certain questions might have like common misconceptions that lead to like having like similar incorrect answers. Because that could like be like if you weigh every question the same, then you're going to like have like potential false positives and like for collusion, especially if they're like pretty hard questions where they're supposed to trick you essentially.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. So I'll have as a caveat. So that's kind of what we're tackling here. So how common the misconception is, I think we've already tackled that with the uniqueness one. So you're absolutely correct. And like we've now like somewhat handled that. But let's just think even purely just from counts, just to decouple the uniqueness question from the number of shared incorrect responses question. But you're absolutely right that we should think of them together, which is why I started with the similarity score. But is there something we could do just from the counts as well? So, yeah, go for it.
I don't think it's like very suspicious because it's only like I think an eighth of the questions. Like, so I don't think it's that highly suspicious. Maybe if it was like 20%, but like it's only an eighth, I don't think it's very suspicious.
Okay. I like that. I like that. So you're now tying in some notion of like, well, how many like it's not too many compared to the entire exam. So I think that's the type of framework that I want to kind of expand on. So when I said they missed, they put the same wrong answer for 5 out of 40 questions. One immediate question that you should ask me is, well, how many questions did they miss? Right? If they put 5 identical wrong answers, but they each only missed 5 questions, that means that every single question that they got wrong, they missed the exact same questions and put the exact same wrong answer for those questions, which might be suspicious. Maybe it won't be suspicious. But compare that to a different pair of students that also put 5 identical wrong answers out of 40 questions. But let's say these 2 students each missed 20 questions. So let's say they each got like 50% on the exam. Well, the second pair of students is much less suspicious than the first pair of students because they missed so many questions. And yeah, some of them they're going to have shared incorrect responses purely by chance. But they would also then have 15 out of, how many questions that they missed that they put different wrong answers for. Maybe like one student missed, but the other didn't. So I guess like the intuition I'm trying to get across is the number of shared incorrect responses, how surprising that is depends on how many incorrect responses there are. If all the incorrect responses that they have are identical, that might be suspicious. But if there's a bunch of questions that either of the 2 students got wrong, then it might not be as suspicious if it's only relatively few. So that's going to be kind of the, oh, sorry, I gave that introduction a little bit too early. So pause that thinking. So here's just a plot of the exam similarity score from a few different exams that I gave. So 2 different quarters, same class. This was an upper division advanced data structures course, midterm final. And kind of as I mentioned, I forgot who had asked the previous question, but similar trend for each of these curves where we have like a straight line that's led by these kind of this dip and then has these squigglies at the end. For each of the curves, it's just that they're like slightly stretched out or squished, depending. So just kind of showing that this trend does show for all of them. I forgot that I had this slide here. But yeah, going back to that previous intuition. So I'm now going to also define 3 other counts and technically a 4th one, but kind of 3 important counts to keep track of. So I'm going to define a red count, a yellow count, and a green count. So given a single pair of students, define the red count of this pair of students as the number of questions where both students put the same exact wrong answer. So in other words, both students got the question wrong and they put the exact same wrong answer. Versus let the yellow count of this pair of students be the number of questions where they put different wrong answers. So both students got the question wrong, but they put 2 different wrong answers. And denote the green count as the number of questions that only one of the 2 students got wrong. So only X got wrong, but Y got right. Or X got right, but Y got wrong. So only one of the 2 students got wrong. And as a kind of proxy denote the black count as just the sum of these three values. So in other words, the black count is the total number of questions that both students missed, either with the same wrong answer or with different wrong answers, or one of the two students missed. So it's the total number of questions that at least one of the two students, or both, right? At least one of the two students missed. And now we're going to think about this in the context of that intuition I tried to motivate. So imagine I have a plot where on the horizontal axis is the black count, so the total number of questions that either student got wrong, so at least one of the two students. And then the vertical axis is either the red count or the yellow count or the green count. If you give me a pair of students, I can calculate these three counts and I can plot those 3 points on this plot. So they have some black count, which tells me the x coordinate, and then they have some green count, some red count, and some yellow count that are the y coordinates of these 3 points. And then I could take the next pair of students and do the same thing. The black count gives me the x coordinate, and I can plot the green, red, and yellow as the y coordinates. And I could do this for every single possible n choose 2 pairs of students. As you can imagine, this would get really, really messy if I just did a scatter plot. So here I'm drawing a 2-dimensional kernel density estimate. So in other words, this contour, the darker bits of it represent the parts of this 2D plot that had the most points, so the highest density of points. And the lighter the color gets, the fewer points were in this kind of range. So you can kind of think of it as you're looking top down on a mountain. This is the peak of the mountain. And then each of these is like a contour that's less and less big. And I could do this for all 3 of the curves. And kind of intuitively, you would expect that the green count would be the highest because you would expect students to, some questions, one will get wrong, some questions the other will get wrong. And actually, empirically, every single exam that I've given over the past, however many years that I've been doing this, I think 3 years, no matter what subject it's been, I've seen a similar trend where you see one big contour for the green that's higher up, and then you see the yellow and red kind of mixed together. And then here I also have best fit linear regression lines on each of these curves. So now what can I do with this to assess how surprising a given pair of students is? Well, if you gave me that pair of students, either I could take outliers from the MES score, or I could see maybe they had similar code in some of the programming assignments, or whatever signal I have that just bubbled them up, or I could just sort in descending order of red count. Maybe that would be interesting. However I've identified this pair of students, I could take them and plot them on this distribution. And now I have context for how surprising this red count or green count or yellow count would be. So just visually, I can kind of visually assess outliers, which is nice. And also, if I want to get a little bit more rigorous, I could do a chi-squared test where I can kind of imagine drawing a line at that black count. My observed values are, this is my observed red count, my observed yellow count, my observed green count. And I can use those best fit curves to get estimated expected counts. It's not really the expected value, but it is essentially a proxy for the expected value for green count, red count, and yellow count for that black count. And you have 2 degrees of freedom because the black count is predetermined. And then given the green count and the yellow count, or given 2 of these, the third one is just black minus those 2. So I can do a chi-squared test with my 3 expected values as circles, my 3 observed values as these crosses, with 2 degrees of freedom, and I can now calculate an empirical p-value, which then if I do this for multiple pairs of students, I would again have to do some type of multiple hypothesis test correction. So this has actually been useful in cases where maybe students either don't have too many shared wrong answers because the collaboration was fairly successful and they did decently well on the exam, or cases where students did have a lot of questions that they missed, but through successful collaboration, they tended to get the most frequent wrong answer, but surprising across all pairs of students in the class. And then this has also been very useful signal as well, especially in some cases where the exam similarity score doesn't quite bubble up the pair of students, but this one has a very kind of clear outlier. So just to kind of summarize some results across multiple exams, the figure that I showed previously was 4 different exams. Each of them had over 400 students. So I had over 80,000 pairwise similarity scores, and I used this specific multiple hypothesis test correction technique. You don't have to worry too much about it. It's just a little bit less strict than Bonferroni correction. And I had no false positives. So every single pair of students that I found with a corrected Q value less than 0.05 was actually ultimately found responsible after submitting the evidence, having them submit their statements to the Academic Integrity Office, going through the full hearing, etc. But I did have a few false negatives. There are a few pairs of students that had Q values greater than my significance threshold, but that were visual outliers in the MESS distribution, and then that I also looked at the red, yellow, and green count distribution and were outliers in that, and were also ultimately found responsible after submitting the evidence and then going through the full academic integrity hearing process. So ultimately, using some combination of these, and of course, for everything that I'm describing here, you do have to manually double check the exam. So I manually looked at timestamps between the pairs of students, manually looked at how reasonable are some of these shared wrong answers. Is there kind of some, if it's like a math question, is there like a clear mathematical mistake that I can attribute to this shared wrong answer? Do they have similarities on other assignments? So you do have to manually look at all of these. This is not by any means being advertised as like an automated way of like run it through and now you have your cases that you should submit. But like it's a nice way of bubbling up potentially interesting cases to look more closely at. And what's important about this is that to just detect the similar students, this took less than an hour of manual inspection. So it very much helps bubble up what are the cases that are most interesting to look at. So I don't have to kind of blindly look at all the exams at once, or what I'm sure happens most frequently, I think a lot of instructors just don't look for it. So it is a nice, relatively not labor-intensive way of looking at potentially suspicious similarities. So the implementation, and I'm just going to kind of quickly go through these so we have 5 minutes left for questions. I've implemented it in this Python tool called MESS. It's a pun on Moss. It's open source. It has minimal dependencies. It's super fast, so it just takes a few seconds to run on a relatively huge exam in a huge class. And it outputs the similarity scores, the best fit exponential distribution, like what are the parameters of that distribution, the p-values for each student, the q-values for each student. It also outputs the red, yellow, and green counts, and it outputs those plots. So it's open source. Feel free to take a look at it. And yeah, future direction. So someone had alluded to this, that exponential distribution I'm currently assuming is appropriate for this, but there might be modifications or extensions of this metric that might better fit an exponential distribution, or there might be other probability distributions that might be a better fit for this score. So like something that takes into account that dip at the beginning, or something that better accounts for like humps that occur later on in the outlier range, just because this is not a continuous curve and we do have a smallest possible count. Like 1 is the smallest possible count for a given similarity score. And maybe the best fit exponential should be modified in some way to better fit the right tail of distribution. So maybe it doesn't as nicely fit the linear portion, but maybe I should shift it a little bit to better fit the right tail. All sorts of things like that. It also currently only looks at identical incorrect responses. So what about identical correct responses where you might have had open-ended questions? So sometimes I like to write questions that there could be multiple possible correct responses that with computer-based exams, it's relatively easy to auto-grade. So things like, here's a red-black tree, give me a number that after you insert it into this will cause exactly 2 AVL rotations or something like that. Like those types of questions, you can have any number of correct answers. And sure, some of them are probably going to be the most frequent, maybe 1 bigger than whatever existing element is in that plot is going to maybe be the most popular, but there will at least be some variability in the correct answers as well. And yeah, I'll go ahead and call it there. Here's my info. My email address and my website are just myname.net or myname@ucsc.edu. And yeah, thanks for listening to me ramble about this stuff for a while.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
I have a question I've been holding since the first minute, which is all of this assume that cheating happens mostly because students are learning from other students. It's collaborative cheating. I think the new world of Gen AI and ChatGPT is that a lot of future cheating is happening with people independently going, finding some AI, and it might be different AIs. Every student might find a different AI tuned to their own needs and getting answers not from each other, but from some other third source. What do you and I and what do others do in that new world, in the new world of students getting answers from other sources rather than each other?
Oh, that is a great question. Yeah, so great point. Yeah, so first, just to reemphasize that all of this is assuming how do I detect collaboration between the students versus there's a lot of different types of academic integrity violations nowadays in this new world order of generative AI. So one approach that I've been using on my exams is I try to write. So one perk of using these computer-based exams is I don't have to have questions that are multiple choice or short answer or like fill in the blank. I could have like interactive questions where I randomly, or in this presentation, I don't do any random generation. So let's just imagine I give them a graph and I ask them run this algorithm how we did in class on this graph and rearrange the values in the order that they'll be visited. So this type of like visual and click and drag type of thing is a little bit harder to craft prompts for. So it's not impossible, so it's just slows them down, but they are still able to probably, especially with like the modern GPTs, they can figure out how to type a response. So that's one hindrance to try to at least slow them down or hopefully prevent them. Another thing is I test my questions through ChatGPT using my instructional staff. So I have my instructional staff run every question and make sure that it either consistently gives the wrong answer or gives inconsistent answers. I usually prefer inconsistent answers so that like the student can't just run ChatGPT and then blindly pick the some other option. So I like it to be non-deterministic. And if there's any question that ChatGPT seems to be like just plowing through really easily, I just take it out and replace it with a different question. I think the next generation is going to end up being, at least for my class personally, so I don't know if you're familiar with Prairie Test and Prairie Learn for like computer-based proctoring. So UCSD is trying to get a central testing facility that is going to be using Prairie Test. So I think now that the COVID pandemic is pretty much behind us, I'm probably going to move towards in-person self-scheduled proctored exams. I don't want in-class exams just because I do feel like there's a lot of students that might not be able to come to class at that exact time, either because of family obligations, work obligations, housing crisis in San Diego that I'm sure folks in Berkeley are familiar with as well. So I do like the flexibility and I do want to have some type of scheduling flexibility in place, but I think I will move to in-person proctored computer-based randomized exams that unfortunately will render a lot of this work that I did useless. But yeah, just some of my current thoughts on that. Yeah.
I'm gonna stop this. Unfortunately, I gotta run to a thing that just grab that and just shoot an email if you want to have follow-up questions. I'm sorry, Serena, I just gotta run. This is the NEMA at UCSD. It's pretty easy to remember. .edu. So give a hand again for the speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure talking with you all. And yeah, hopefully I'll hear from some of you soon.
Yeah, I've been waiting to have this happen. So this is the result of lots of backroom conversations.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll talk to you later, Dan. See you, everyone.
All right, take care. Thanks again.